Alright, y'all, this is Draft Dad. I'm going to bring to you an Amonkhet Remastered limited guide. The format's been out for a little bit under a week now, and I've been drafting a ton and learning quite a bit, so let's jump right in. Alright, the first thing I want to go over some of the major themes in Amonkhet Remastered. It is a combination of two sets that were released prior, Amonkhet and Hour of Devastation. So they kind of, Wizards took out all the filler and bundled together a bunch of the themes. So one of the major themes is Recursion. Alright, you're going to get that in Trials. Each color gets one. When you cast a Trial, it has a pretty minor effect. Trial of Ambition just makes your opponent sack a creature. Usually not especially playable unlimited. Cartouche is an enchantment. When you cast it, if you have a Trial in the field, you get to return it to your hand, so you can replay that Trial. The Cartouche by itself, not very impressive. Look at the Cartouche of Zeal here. It makes a creature not be able to block, gives a creature haste and +1/+1. But when you combine the two, now you're making your opponent sack two creatures, and then you've made your creature a threat. If you can do that multiple times, you can see the Trials are uncommon, the Cartouches are common. You can get a bunch of Cartouches, you draw your Trial, you start playing the Cartouche, and then you just go off. So you recur that effect over and over again, and eventually it just destroys your opponent. And these are two of the weaker ones. Trial of Ambition and Cartouche of Zeal are not the best. They get more broken and more busted. So Trials are usually very high picks, and you should, if you get one, you should look at Cartouches a little bit higher in your pick order. The other one is Embalm, Eternalize. That's another way that you recur things. So an Embalm creature, when it dies, you can pay the Embalm cost, and it returns as whatever it was, except it's a zombie token. Eternalize is a little bit different. You pay the Eternalize cost, and it returns as a zombie token, but it's always a 4/4. And then they all also contain all the text, right? So it'd still be flying in this example. It's one of the major themes. The other one is deserts. You're going to see these a lot. You get a desert in every pack. It's going to look like one of these. There's one for each of the colors, and they cycle. That is huge. It prevents flood in this format. If you need the land, you play it. If you don't, you cycle it. And then there's different benefits for having cycling cards, because this is a cycling set. So they work very, very well, and just about every deck is going to want a few of them. You can also sacrifice. So each color gets an uncommon desert that uses some effect. I think If Near Deadlands is probably my favorite. Basically, if you have 4 or 5 deserts in your deck, you draw this, and in different desert, you can sacrifice another desert to put 2 -1/-1 creatures on counters on a creature, kill a creature, and you can do that over and over again as long as you got that land, right? There's also different things that are enabled by deserts. So this is a pretty basic one. They get a little bit more nutty, and we'll get into those. But Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, 2 mana for an 0/4 wall. Not impressive. If you have a desert in play, though, you can use it to ping your opponent every single turn. Then it becomes a very annoying card. And if you're racing, and this is a very aggressive format, your opponent's at 6 or 7, this starts to become a clock, right? If you're in a board stalemate. So, minor themes, there's a few. I think these are left over from Hour of Devastation and Amonkhet. So, Afflict, you'll see a few creatures with Afflict. Spellweaver Eternal, I think, is one of the better ones. It's Prowess as well, and you'll see that on a few cards. Monuments, these are pretty cool. These are legendary artifacts. Every color gets one. It makes... all the monuments are artifacts that cost 3 mana. They make a certain color of creature cost 1 less to cast, and they provide an effect. So Ronus and Oketra, I think, are the two best. Ronus, whenever you cast a creature spell, it gives another target creature +2/+2 and trample until end of turn, which is huge, right? A lot of games, if they're not over and super aggressive, rely on evasive creatures, either flying or trample or some way to get through. Another theme you're going to see, this is only at uncommon and rare, are split cards. And these are 2 spells. The bottom one's going to have Aftermath, which means you can only cast it from your graveyard. They usually work well together. So this is one of the better ones at uncommon. This is called Destined to Lead. So Destined makes your creature +1/+0 and indestructible. Lead, if you cast that, makes it so your creature has to be blocked by all creatures, right? So when you attack with it, your creature has to be blocked by everything that's able to block it. So this, as you can see, makes for some pretty crazy alpha strikes. If you're able to get a deck that's set up a board stalemate and you all have a bunch of creatures on the field, you cast this on your creature, turn it sideways, and then you can attack with the rest of your creatures for free and win the game. Just do an alpha strike. So those are some of the minor themes. Now we'll get into the colors here. So white. White has a couple main mechanics, and then we'll also go over their mythic uncommon. There's a few different very, very good uncommons that slot into certain decks, and so we'll talk about those a little bit later. But one of the main themes for white is going to be Exert. Gustwalker, I think, is the best common 2-drop creature in the set. And when you exert it, it taps for attacking, but it doesn't untap during its next untap phase. So if you have a way to untap it before then, you can still do it again. There's a lot of different enablers for that we'll get into. So when you exert it, it becomes a 3/3 flyer. So if you can't get past your opponent's creatures, you can make it a 3/3 flyer and get in. Another theme that they have is zombies. White-black is the zombie deck. Usually white doesn't get zombies, but they get a lot of mummies and stuff in this set, so you'll see that. And as far as Mythic Uncommon, there's a few of them, but they slot into different decks better. I think Cast Out is probably the one that's going to be the most consistently good in any deck. There's a lot of Recursion, as we've talked about in this set. There's really deadly artifacts and enchantments in this set, and this doesn't care about any of them. If it's a creature with Indestructible, if it's one of the 3 mythic gods that come back to their opponent's hand if you kill them, doesn't care. It exiles it, and it can be any non-land permanent. So it's also got cycling if for whatever reason you need that. And it has flash, so you can just flash this in, use it as a combat trick. It's a little bit expensive, but it's just a very, very powerful card. All right, let's get into red. Common theme for red is also Exert. You're going to see that in all the Naya colors, right? So Neff Crop Entangler, another good 2-drop. 2/1 trample for 2, not good, but when you exert it, it becomes a 3/3 trample. Again, you're getting that evasion. You're able to pump it past your creatures and make blocking very, very difficult for your opponent. Another theme they have is that spells matter. So they have some prowess creatures, and they also have creatures where whenever, like Firebrand Archer here, another 2-drop, whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it's going to deal 1 damage to each opponent. So this is going to add up over time, just like that desert, right? If you're pinging your opponent every turn and you're in red, so you're already pretty aggressive, this thing can become a clock. The Mythic Uncommon, I think, is going to be Sand Strangler. I think it's not particularly close for red. This thing is just a Flame Tongue Cavalier if you have a desert in play. And we talked about deserts earlier, where you have the enablers. I think this is one of the most powerful ones. So if you control the desert, or a desert's in your graveyard. So if you cycle your desert, it goes to your graveyard, you still get this effect. Sand Stranglers are 3/3 for 4. That also kills a creature when it comes into play. It deals 3 damage. So it's basically a 2-for-1 for 4 mana. Fantastic card. A lot of the creatures in this set are small, especially when they're not exerted. All right, let's get into green. This is the last of the Naya colors. They also have a lot of exert cards. So Hooded Brawler, I think, is their best at common. It becomes massive, a 5/4 for 3 mana when you exert it. Other than that, it's a 3/2, which is still fine in limited. Another theme they have that we're going to get into is -1/-1 counters. So Ornery Kudu, these are overstated creatures. So a 3/4 for 3 is very good. But when it comes into the battlefield, you got to put a -1/-1 counter on a creature you control. Usually you put it on the Kudu itself, it's a 2/3, and that's a pretty bad deal. Not a great creature. But if you have some sort of creature that you don't care about, there's a mana producer like Naga Vitalis, which is a 1/2 that adds mana. You don't care if that thing becomes an 0/1 because you're not swinging with it anyway. And then you just get to have a more powerful creature without the counter, without the drawback. Their Mythic Uncommon, I had a tough time with green. There's a lot of very good ones. There's a really good combat trick called Synchronized Strike, and Trial of Beasts is fantastic. But I think I have a soft spot for Sifter Worm. It's a 7/7 for 7. It's an aggro format, but if you can cast this, you scry 3. reveal the top card of your library, and gain life equal to its converted mana cost. That can just win you the game. I had a deck with 3 Sifter Worms in it, and multiple times I was able to cast a Sifter Worm, scry 3 into the next Sifter Worm, and gain 3 life. And gain 7 life. This thing is also a 7/7 trample, so it's bigger than anything in the format, and it's going to just trample over everything that they try to put in front of it. This card is fantastic. It can pull you back out of a game you're losing, just with the life gain, and with scrying away your unwanted lands, because at 7 mana, you're not going to want any more lands, right? All right, black. There's 2 themes with this one. This one's going to have cycling and -1/-1 counters. So their cycling theme is very strong in this set. It's not nearly as broken as it was in Ikoria, but there's a lot of cards with cycling. So Horror of the Broken Lands. It's a 5 mana, 4/4. Whenever you cycle a card, it gets +2/+1 until end of turn. You can do that multiple times a turn, or you can cycle this card for just 1 black mana. Now, what makes this great, the cycling mechanics in this set, is they make combat very, very difficult for your opponent if you have any cards in your hand. If you do, your opponent's not going to know if you have a cycler, so it's going to be difficult to block, because this thing could be a 6/5, it could be an 8/6. The other thing that you want to notice, it's when you cycle or discard. So if you have a way to discard cards, you still get the effect. Another one is the -1/-1 counters theme, just like green had. So Soul Stinger here, decent 4-drop, 4/5. Black usually doesn't get a creature statted like that at common for that efficient. When it comes in, it becomes a 2/3 if you put the 2 -1/-1 counters on it, or you can put them on something else. But when it dies, you may put a -1/-1 counter on any creature, even when your opponent's control, for each one on the Soul Stinger. So if it's a 2/3, your opponent trades off for some creature of your opponent's, you can also put 2 -1/-1 counters on another creature an opponent controls and kill that one. Mythic Uncommon. Black I also had a hard time with. I think black is one of the weaker colors in this set. I chose Bone Picker because it can be completely ridiculous how cheap it becomes. If a creature dies, if you're able to use your removal, kill a creature, like that 2 mana Trial that we were talking about earlier, Trial of Ambition, this thing only costs 1 black mana to cast. Again, creatures are pretty small in this format. It's a 3/2 flyer, so it's evasive, and it's Death Touch. So if your opponent has a huge flying bomb, this thing will get in the way and trade with it and kill it. All right, last is blue. So their 2 themes are going to be cycling and Spells Matter. Cycling, this is one of the enablers for it. It's not particularly powerful. It's a standard 3-drop, 2/3, but again, it makes combat difficult for your opponent, because your opponent doesn't know if you have any cyclers in hand, and you can make this a 3/4 or 4/5. And it's also a little bit cheaper as well. Spells Matter. This is one of the only ones at common that's really good. But if you cast a non-creature spell, you can use it as a looter. It's a 1/3 for 2 mana. And again, if you're looting with it, whenever you discard, it's going to trigger your Heckma Sentinels as well. So if you cast like a Hieroglyphic Illumination, which is 4 mana, draw 2 cards, you have the threat of looting when you go into combat with Heckma Sentinels. Or on your opponent's turn, if they swing in, Hieroglyphic Illumination is an instant. It's going to make combat very difficult for your opponent. Their Mythic Uncommon, again, there's a few different choices, but I chose Lay Claim. It's the most consistently good in any blue deck. It is very expensive. Again, another 7-drop, but it cycles if you have it early, or you don't have the mana for it, and if you draw it late, it just takes the best permanent on the battlefield from your opponent. And it's not just creatures. It's anything they got you can take. So, very valuable. All right. So, I'm going to get into a few of the highlighted decks. So, Naya Beatdown is what you should default to. Most of the commons in these sets, in this set, support this theme. All right. And it's go wide, aggro, turn all the things sideways. So, Trial of Solidarity. We were talking about those trials. This is a huge enabler. We're talking about Exert, which makes it so your creatures don't untap the next untap phase. Well, if they have Vigilance, then they're not going to be tapped. So you can use Exert again the next turn. This is going to give all creatures you control +2/+1 and Vigilance. And if you have a cartouche to bounce this, it's going to make your creatures insane, huge, unblockable. And you can use it repeatedly. So I think Trial of Solidarity and those go-wide decks is going to really tie the damn room together. And it's going to enable a lot of those alpha strikes where your opponent just can't withstand the exert over and over again. Honored Crop Captain. So this is a gold card, again supporting that go wide strategy. White has a bunch of ways to make a ton of different tokens, and this is going to give them all +1/+0. Also, if you have Trial of Solidarity, an Honored Crop Captain, and a bunch of tokens, all your creatures are going to be +3/+1, and your opponent's just going to die. You're going to wipe their board with a bunch of little 1/1 tokens. Another enabler. This is an exert enabler for on-crop champion. You can exert this, and then you untap all other creatures you control. So if you have a bunch of exert creatures on the battlefield, you can exert them, tap them, exert this, they untap, and then you can use the exert again the next turn. So that's another enabler. I'm going to talk now about some of the draft guides. So I think in this set, it's hugely important to get a 2-drop. To get your 2-drop slot is robust as you can. What you'll find is when you draft the set, you're going to have a ton of 3-drops. You're going to have like 10 3-drops in your deck. But your 1s and 2s is going to be scarce. So you have to prioritize 2-drops. One of the standard ones, Naya doesn't have as big of a problem as other colors do, as blue and black do. So Ronus is stalwart. You should be able to pick some of these up a little bit later. It's a vanilla 2/2 for 2, but when you exert it, it becomes a 3/3 and can't be blocked by any of your opponent's little chumps, right? Anything power 2 or less. So it gives it some form of evasion. The other thing you want to draft are the enablers. We talked about Trial of Solidarity. Another great one at common is Dauntless Haven. It's evasive, so you should be able to get it in. It's a 3-mana 2/1 flyer. Not super impressive, but whenever it attacks, you can untap a creature you control. So if you exert the Ronus' Stalwart, you attack with Dauntless Haven. Now you're attacking for 5. Both are evasive, and then the Ronus' Stalwart untaps, so you can do it again next turn. The other thing I wanted to chat about with this draft guide is cheap removal. I think it's huge in this set to be able to interact with the board. You need to be able to take out your first couple of threats from your opponent because Exert is so powerful. So Magma Spray, I think, is one of the best commons in the set, along with Gustwalker. And it deals 2 damage to a creature, and if it dies, it's exiled. There's a lot of recursion that we talked about in this set as well, and this makes it so it's exiled and it can't recur. You can use this on an Embalm creature, and it's hugely devastating for your opponent when you do that. So Magma Spray, if you see it, it's definitely first pickable. Very strong in this format. All right, the other deck I wanted to talk about, I should say, is Embalm Eternalize. So this one is based on Graveyard Recursion. It's tempo, and it makes your opponent's removal bad, except for, of course, cards like Magma Spray and Puncturing Blow. But you never really want to use removal on a creature that's just going to come back. So Aven Wind Guide is the gold signpost uncommon for this. It makes creature tokens you control have flying and vigilance. To note, again, Embalm and Eternalize, they don't bring the card back from the graveyard. They remove that card, they exile it, and then you create a token of it. So if you have an Embalm creature that comes back and it's a 2/2, with this card in play, it would be a 2/2 Flying Vigilance, which is obviously so much better, right? And it's also fairly statted, a 2/3 Flying Vigilance for 4. Not bad. Another great one, Oketra's Attendant. This is going to combine some mechanics, right? It has cycling for 2, so if you need to cycle it early game, you can do that, and you can always embalm it later. It's also a pretty strong creature, 5/5 flying for, or 3/3 flying for 5 in this format is really good, and then it just comes back if your opponent kills it. Fantastic. And one of my favorite 2-drops in the set, because blue just doesn't get a whole lot of good ones, is Labyrinth Guardian. It has a drawback where if it's target of a spell, you sacrifice it, but who wants to use removal on this thing, right? So you don't care. If someone wants to use their pump spell on it to kill it, fine. They traded their pump spell for your 2-drop, and then you're just going to bring it back later. And it's got a big butt, so it's a 2/3 for 2, and so it can help to block in the early game. Fantastic card. All right, so Embalm Draft Guide. 2-drops. This is the big weakness of the deck, but there's Anointer Priest. We talked about Gustwalker, which isn't an Embalm or Eternalized creature, but obviously if it's there, you're just going to take it. There's Labyrinth Guardian that we talked about, but that's uncommon. So Anoint Your Priest, it has some synergies with Embalm creatures. Anytime a token enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. You can easily pick up multiple of these in a draft, and they can help you win a race. Enablers, love this one. 4 mana for a 2/4. When you play it, you search your library for any card in there with Eternalize or Embalm, put it into the graveyard, and then if you ever play any card with Embalm or Eternalize from your graveyard, you draw a card. So usually this is 2/4 for 4, tutor creature, and draw a card. Fantastic. It becomes out of control if you get a lot of Embalm creatures and your opponent doesn't get rid of this, because you just start drawing into more of your Embalm creatures. Cheap removal. Impeccable Timing is one I chose here. There's a few different options. White has some good options for cheap removal. Blue has Unquenchable Thirst, which we'll get to. But Impeccable Timing, you can use this in response to your opponent activating an Exert trigger. So if they have a 3/3 for whatever reason that has Exert, and it would become a 4/4, you can respond to that Exert trigger and kill it when it's still a 3/3. All right, Cycling. So this one is a little bit underplayed. Again, you want to be a Naya generally. In one of those colors, this is the 2 non-Naya colors, right? So this is Dimir. This is blue-black. So this is Cycling and Discard Matters. We talked about that. It's definitely a controlling deck, and it makes combat really scary for your opponent because they never know if you have any cyclers. So the Signpost uncommon for this one is Shadowstorm Vizier. This is one of the least impressive Signpost uncommons. It's a 1/3 flyer for 2, which is fine, but it gets +1/+1, so it can make combat difficult, but it doesn't have a lot of power. If this was a 2/2 flyer, it'd be absolutely fantastic. But at 1/3, it just becomes hard for this to deal a lot of damage and become a big threat on the board. It's usually just a very good blocker. Again, you'll pick this up, you'll play it, it's just not exciting. Another one that is exciting is Ominous Sphinx. Now, this is an air elemental. 4/4 flyer for 5 mana. Whenever you cycle a card, a creature an opponent controls gets -2/-0 until end of turn. That's amazing. It makes combat pretty impossible for your opponent because you can shrink their creatures, and they never know when you have a cycler in hand. So fantastic card. Pick those early and often. It is a little expensive, but it's very good. Another very good one, if it lives, is Ruthless Sniper. So every time you cycle or discard a card, you can pay 1. If you do, put a -1/-1 counter on a target creature. -1/-1 means a lot in this format. Again, creatures are small. There's a lot of 2/1s running around that this will just pick off and kill. It's also just it's a 1 mana creature, so it's a 1-drop. It does get a little bit expensive to cycle over and over again because it's so aggressive. You're going to be cycling this format so aggressive. You're going to want to kill creatures on turns 3 and 4 when you don't have a lot of mana in play. But it's fantastic once you can get it going and you can start generating those -1/-1 counters. All right, 2-drops. This is the difficult one for this. Obviously, there's Labyrinth Guardian that we talked about. In black, you have Festering Memory for 1. There's I think Miasmic Zombie or something for 2 mana. But there's just not a lot of great options. So I chose Censor. If you can pick this up, it is definitely playable in this deck because it cycles. And also, if you have 2 mana up on turn 2 and your opponent's going to play a spell, usually they're going to tap out for it and it just stops their spell. So it's usually better to get cheap removal, cheap ways to interact. We talked about Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, which is good in this deck. It's 2 mana for the 0/4 Wall. And then you'll want to play a lot of Cycling Deserts in this deck as well, so it usually should be activated where it can ping your opponent. Enablers. So Vile Manifestation is a 2-drop. It's an 0/4 Wall at the beginning of the game, but as the game goes on, this card can get a little bit nutty. You start getting a bunch of cyclers in the graveyard, and it gets +1/+0 for each one of those. It's not uncommon to see this thing at a 4/4 or 5/4, even in the mid-game. And then it becomes a real threat. Cheap removal. So we talked about Unquenchable Thirst. Taps a creature, and if you control a desert, it makes a creature unable to untap during its untap step. And if you control a desert, it taps it when it comes into play. So it's definitely playable either way. Obviously, it's just going to be a lot better if you have a desert. Next one, Zombies. So Control, attrition, brains. That's what this deck does. This is white-black. The signpost card is Wayward Servant. Again, not especially powerful, but it pings or it drains your opponent for 1 each time you play a zombie, and that can get out of control pretty quick if you have different ways to bring zombies back or create multiple zombie tokens. Binding Mummy. Fantastic 2-drop in the zombies deck. It taps down your opponent's creatures or artifacts if for whatever reason you wanted to do that whenever a zombie comes into play. So eventually this thing's just going to tap down a creature every turn. If you have multiple ones in play, your opponent can't even block anything. Great uncommon for this deck, and any deck, is Gravedigger. The card goes way back, but it's a 4-mana 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you can return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. A lot of zombies in this format are pretty small, 2 toughness, so they tend to die quite a bit, and Gravedigger can bring them back, especially your Binding Mummies and Wayward Servants and those types of things. So, 2 drops. There's quite a few. Kenra Eternal is one I highlighted here. It's 2-mana 2/2, Afflict 1. Afflict is when an opponent blocks the creature, they take a damage anyway. It's kind of a boring ability, but it's a nice little bonus. So that's a zombie. You can get quite a few 2-drops in this deck. Enablers, Lord of the Accursed. There's a couple different zombie +1, all zombies get +1/+1 effects. One is at rare, called Liliana's Mastery. But Lord of the Accursed is at uncommon. And then it also has all zombies gain menace until end of turn, which is huge, especially if you have some Binding Mummies in play, so your opponent's creatures are getting tapped, they just can't block. Cheap removal, there's a ton of it. I just chose Compulsory Rest here. It's the pacifism of the set. One of the main drawbacks of this is when you enchant an opponent's creature with it, your opponent can sack it to gain 2 life. So it doesn't work very well against Embalm creatures or creatures that don't care about going to the graveyard, so because your opponent can just get them back. All right. I think there's a couple more to go. I want to get into Golgari Counters here. So this is just a grindy deck. This is, again, a difficult deck to get into. It's more based around control and attrition, like the Zombies deck. The Signpost in common for it's very good. Flyers tend to win this format if games go long, right? So the Signpost uncommon here makes it a pain in the ass to attack into. So it's a 1/4 reach for 3. Whenever it deals combat damage to a creature, you also put a -1/-1 counter on that creature. Whenever you put a -1/-1 counter on any creature that you control, your opponents control, for whatever reason, it drains your opponent, which can get pretty crazy pretty quick because there's a lot of ways to throw around -1/-1 creature or counters. One of those ways is Cartouche of Ambition. This gives your creature +1/+1 lifelink, which is huge in an aggressive racing aggro style format. And it also puts a -1/-1 counter on a creature. Again, there's a lot of different 2/1s and 3/1s in this set. The creatures are very small, so it usually kills a creature too. Fantastic. Cartouche, probably the best one. It's up there with Cartouche of Knowledge, I think. Defiant Great Maw. There's a lot of different creatures like this. So Soul Stinger we talked about. Great Maw's kind of the opposite, right? When it comes into play, you put 2 -1/-1 counters on a creature you control, so it becomes a 2/3 for 3. Not very impressive. But whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on Defiant Great Maw, remove a -1/-1 counter from another target creature you control. So it can take the -1/-1 counters off your creatures, make them bigger, sacrificing itself, and there's different synergies there. And again, these are going to trigger Obelisk Spider if you have one out. All right, 2 drops. There's a ton of good 2 drops in green. I wanted to highlight one that has -1/-1 counters, so that's an uncommon called Exemplar of Strength. It's a 4/4 for 2. Pretty crazy. When it comes into play, it becomes a 1/1. So if you draw this late in the game, it's usually not very effective because you can't attack in with it. But if you're on the play and it's turn 2, you play this, odds are you're going to be able to swing with it. But once you swing with it once, it becomes a 2/2 and you gain a life. If you're able to swing with it again, it's a 3/3 and then a 4/4. So fantastic card if you get it going early. Enablers, there's so many enablers. for this archetype. They're just very slow and kind of clunky. This is one of them. Nests of Scarabs, I've seen it be effective a few times, but usually it's do nothing. And late in the game, it's really do nothing because you've spent your -1/-1 counters cards. But if you do get it going early and you have the nut stack, this is going to create a million of those little Scarabs, and you're going to overwhelm your opponent with them. Splendid Agony for cheap removal. It's 3 mana, but it's an instant speed spell, and it's distribute 2 -1/-1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures. So if your opponent has 2 2/1s on the field, which is common, or 2 creatures with 1 toughness, very common in this set, it's a 2-for-1 built in. And if you have synergies like Nest of Scarabs or something, it's also going to create that many 1/1 Scarabs for you, insect tokens. So this card is fantastic. Great cheap removal, can often 2-for-1 an opponent. And it also makes combat really difficult for your opponents if you have one. All right, last one, Spells Matter. So this is based on evasion, prowess, and synergizing for the win. There's a lot of different Spells Matter combinations in recent sets in Magic, so you should be pretty familiar with this one. The Signpost uncommon, again, not especially powerful. Late game, if you draw it, though, becomes a real threat. I've seen this be like a 7/4 is the biggest I've seen one of these. For a 3 mana card, 7/4 flyer, that's a big dragon. So if you get it out early, it's usually not very useful. Maybe it's a 1/4 or 2/4, which is fine. But late game, this thing becomes a real threat. Cryptic Serpent. Again, early, it's 7 mana, 6 mana, 5 mana. Not great for a 6/5, but if you draw it late, it's 3 mana, 4 mana for a 6/5. I've had it multiple times be just 2 blue mana for this card for a 6/5. Fantastic deal. Big old creature is going to dominate the battlefield. Thorned Moloch, we were talking about prowess. That's whenever you cast a non-creature spell, so it doesn't have to be an instant or a sorcery. It can be an enchantment, an artifact, whatever. It gets +1/+1 for each spell that you cast, non-creature, during that turn. And this one also has first strike when it's attacking, so it makes combat very difficult for your opponent if you have a bunch of instants in your hand or something. All right. For 2 drops, Spellweaver Eternal. We touched on this earlier here. Fantastic card for 2 mana. Very aggressive. It has prowess, so it makes combat difficult. And if your opponent blocks it, it's usually going to trade, but it has that afflict ability on it, so it's still going to deal your opponent 2 damage. Enablers. Riddle Form, one of the best 2 drops you can have in this deck. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, it becomes a 3/3 Sphinx. And it also has that little ability to scry 1. Late game, very helpful to filter away any unneeded lands. Probably don't want to use that too much. Early game, you'd rather be playing spells, but if you're flooded, it's fantastic to help get rid of those lands for you. Scry them away. Cheap removal. I highlighted Magma Spray earlier, but I think Abrade is one of the top removal spells in the set. There are some artifacts like Edifice of Authority, that you really want to kill and get rid of, but usually it'll just deal 3 damage to a creature. It's instant speed. It's 2 mana. Fantastic card. Pick them up if you can. Definitely first pickable. All right, that's all for me. Let me know what you all think in the comments. Thank you so much for tuning in.